Today on the podcast, part 2 of my favorite endings you may have missed. That's coming at you today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. As always, thank you for tuning in. Before we jump into today's episode, I wanted to begin with a quick announcement. As regular listeners know, I will be offering a college-level course available to all of my listeners, which will be on an introduction to philosophy, a general overview of philosophy. The class will be offered for credit or for audit, and yes, it will be accredited. If you want to use it for college credit, try to transfer it into the college of your choosing. The class will commence on August 7th. It will be held every Thursday at 7 p.m. for about 2 hours. And those sessions will be recorded. So if you're not able to actually sit in on the sessions, people who register for the class will have access to those afterwards. Registration is now open and will continue until August 4th. That's when it will close there. As for how to register for the class, you go to myprofer.com. That's myprofer.com. You go ahead and you join as a student. You'll receive a confirmation email. You click on that, you log back in, and then you navigate over to the side menu and you go looking for classes, and you'll find in there my Introduction to Philosophy class. And then you go ahead and you will register for that class. If you want to take it for credit, you'll have to go ahead and do the long registration as a student. If you just want to audit the class, you can go ahead and just register and pay straight away. Be sure to complete that registration. Merely joining as a student does not log you in my class. It does not register you for my class. You actually have to go through the full process, so be sure to do that. Additional details are below. So with that, back to the show. So our first clip comes out of our AI episode. Now, this is an older episode on the podcast, and I do plan to do another episode on AI, partially because there's been a number of developments in that space since we first released this episode, and partially because I've been toying with AI as it's developed, and I have additional thoughts on things that trouble me about it. And so just by way of a little bit of a prelude, I've been testing it in terms of, trying to discern some of its strengths and weaknesses and what the real dangers of it may be. And some of my more recent tests, I've been very troubled by what I find when I test it in an area that I actually have expertise in. And so, for example, patrology, the Church Fathers, I went ahead and I began to test AI and see what it had to say about different aspects of the Church Fathers. And a couple of the things that I found, which have been alarming, is that I found that there's this sort of sycophantic tendency with AI, that if it can discern what it is that you want, it will go ahead and feed that want. And the other thing that's really troubling is it feeds it with false information. Now, don't get me wrong. I am not talking about sort of like a biased Google search where it's giving you legitimate sources and it's sort of stacking the deck in a misleading way or something like that. What I mean by false information is it just makes stuff up. It will whole cloth create false quotations, even false Greek quotations, false citations, dead links, things like that. It is very bizarre. It's like sitting with a very clever artists or something like that. Anyway, more on that when I do the updated episode, but needless to say, that was deeply troubling. And in the first episode, I did talk about other things that I toyed with in terms of AI, talking about having ethics conversations and logic conversations with ChatGPT and the ways in which that was eye-opening and troubling all at the same time. So anyway, I do plan to do another episode on that. However, the portion of that episode that I want to offer to you today is the part where I actually talk about things like, is AI conscious? Can it become conscious? Does it have a mind? And what are the real dangers of AI? As I said, this is dated, and I would add to it and expand to it as I plan to in doing a follow-up episode. But for now, let's take a listen. Let's go into this other question that sometimes emerges, right? The question of whether or not AI can become conscious, right? That's one of the things that emerges a lot. Is it conscious? Could it become conscious? Might it become self-aware? All those sorts of things. So speaking as a metaphysician and a realist, I'll answer candidly, which the answer is no. It is not and cannot be conscious. I think what's going on here is two things. All right, the question emerges largely because of a feature of human epistemology. How do you know that you know that you know? And the way that's paired then with a sort of causal issue that has to do with essence and energies, which I mentioned earlier. So here's the thing. Like you and I, the Eastern Church Fathers talk about this a lot, right? Basil of Caesarea in one of his letters talks about the fact that we actually don't peer into the fabric of reality and see the nature or the essence of the thing in the abstract. What happens is we encounter the energies or the operative powers, the articulations or expressions of the nature, and from that we infer the underlying nature. So let's use some examples. Let's say we land on a planet and we meet a species of thing and we're like, is it intelligent, right? Well, the fact of the matter is we can't just peer into the head of the thing that we encountered and say like, oh, yep, I see intelligence in there. Yep, that's in there, right? You don't see the sort of vague floating sort of intelligence. You don't see the mind in the abstract. Rather, just like with you or with me, how I know that you have a mind is that I begin to see it articulate itself. You begin to speak. You begin to reason, right? You begin to articulate your thoughts. And so what happens is the reason I believe that there are other minds in the world, minds other than mine, is not because I actually ever perceive the mind directly, right? And, lest you conflate brain and mind, yes, cutting open a head and seeing the brain is still not seeing the mind. You're seeing the instrumental means of by which the mind operates, which is, the brain, but you're not seeing the mind itself, right? The mind is intangible. It's inaccessible to you. And so you come to believe that other people are intelligent and have a mind because you hear them talk, you hear them reason, right? You encounter the operations or the operative powers that express mind out in the world. And from that, you make an inference, right? Now, that epistemological limitation is what occasions this question, right? Because what happens is we have that limitation paired with our ability to imitate certain operations creates the possibility of false judgment. So let's put aside AI for a minute, right? Let's do a scenario where you and I decide to go into business because we want to create some fake fireplaces, right? And what we do is we're able to create this holographic image, right? This 3D holographic image that, you can walk all the way around it and it dances and it flickers and it shoots off light and all the rest. And it looks just like fire. And you're like, looking at it, man, I would think that's really fire. And then we're also able to, create this sort of, this heating system that it doesn't just put off heat, right? Like it puts off heat in a way that mirrors the way the hologram does, right? So the way it generates it actually imitates the ways in which fire, radiates heat. And so you're sitting there, you're going like, wow. And let's say that the heater is not just heating, right? Internal, like core temperature, right? The deeper you go into the flame, it actually can cook things, right? So the heating, processes are actually enough that you could cook, a piece of meat inside the flame just like you would within fire and so on. And so basically what we've done is we've started to create such an impressive imitation of fire that to the senses you'd go, it's fire, right? Like if I didn't know that you guys had produced holograms, if I didn't know heat and I walked up to it and I was like, yep, that looks like fire. And my hand's getting close to it and feels hot. And I take a hot dog and I put it on a stick and I put it in there and it's roasting it. Like, yep, it's fire. And I would make that judgment. And the fact of the matter is though, the judgment is wrong. So our hologram might be so good, right? That basically when you look at it, right, everything about it, from what you can tell, it's fire, right? And it wouldn't be crazy for you to infer that, right? Because you're sitting there looking at it and saying, well, the way the light is dancing, right? The way it gives off heat, the way it cooks things, all of that, yep, definitely fire. And what you'd be doing is you'd be inferring from those surface level operations the underlying ontology. But the fact of the matter is, you and I, when we developed that holographic technology, we didn't make fire, right? What we did is we imitated the externalities, the operations, the articulations of fire such
that we can trick your senses. But no matter how close we make those, those articulations mirror real fire, we still haven't made fire. What we've made is a hologram, right? And this is, I think, what's going on with regard to AI. People are sort of weirded out for the same sort of reason, because they're looking at AI and they're saying it's imitating certain things that I typically associate with reason, right? I infer that there is mind underneath here because there's certain responses, because there's certain inference, because there's certain rationality, because there's certain interactions or whatever it may be. And those various expressions of mind are the things that tell me there's a mind underneath. So in a similar sort of way, what they're wondering, right? What the question about consciousness is all about is saying, well, what if this gets so close to a human mind in the way that it interacts with me that I really can't tell the difference? Have they actually produced mind? And the answer is the same in our holographic fire. No, they haven't. Right? What they've produced is they've produced an imitation, right? They've produced a machine that's able to imitate all the things that cause you to infer mind underneath, but they haven't made mind. In the order of nature, energies are actually produced by the underlying nature, right? We have a mind, and that mind has the potential to cultivate intelligence, right? To cultivate rationality, to cultivate language and all the rest. And then those are an outgrowth of that. What's happening in terms of the ontology of AI, you don't have mind, right? You have a machine, right? And the machine is being trained. It's being programmed and trained in order to imitate the things that you typically use to infer mind. But it is not a mind. And so that's where I think what's going on is there is an epistemological flub happening, right? Where we are so accustomed to inferring from the externalities, the underlying nature, that when the externalities come a little too close to, externalities of mind, there emerges the question, is there really mind underneath it? But just like in the case of our holographic fire, the answer is no, right? The underlying ontology, we know what it is. It's a machine, right? It is not actually a mind. It's just that it is a machine that's capable of producing externalities that are so similar at some point. Right now, obviously, you can tell when you're chatting with a bot, right? But at some point, the question is, might we get to a point where the externalities are so similar to human mind that I don't know when I'm chatting with a bot and I don't know when I'm chatting with a real human being? And if that were to happen, would it be conscious? And the answer is no, because the underlying ontology is still machine, right? It's just that the externalities are such, the limitations of your epistemology, the fact that you don't peer through reality to the underlying nature, are such that your senses can be tricked. But that doesn't change what the underlying ontology is, right? The underlying ontology, the energies, the operative powers, are the energies and operative powers of a machine, not of mind. Now, there is a danger, though, of this impression of intelligence. And there's a couple of different dangers here. And these are where I think we're getting into the real dangers of AI. I actually don't think the real dangers of AI are inherently economic. As I said, I would like to believe that those sorts of differences between real art and AI generated images, or real art and AI generated music, if it really is to be called music, melodies maybe, my hope is actually that what that will do is serve as a corrective for us rethinking how we approach and consume things like music and story and art and all the rest. That's my hope, and I might be wrong, and we all end up in the sort of a Wall-E scenario, but that would be my hope. I don't think those are the real, most insidious dangers of AI. I think the real dangers of AI, really are located in the fact that it has the appearance of intelligence. And here's why. AI is not intelligent. It is artificial intelligence, right? It's imitating intelligence. And the fact of the matter is AI has deep and abiding biases, Now I know this because when ChatGPT, yes, there's been all sorts of different stories that have come out where people have exposed biases, right? They've gotten the underlying code to expose itself and demonstrate that it has certain sort of unprompted prompts built into it, or that people have pointed out the ways in which chat will generate certain responses that divulge political biases or whatever else. And that's all very real. And I too, when ChatGPT first came out, I ended up, spending a lot of time just interacting with it in order to try to see like how intelligent is it. And I don't mean intelligence because I actually think that has to do with the underlying ontology of mind and reason and things like that. But how capable of imitating reason is it? How capable of being corrected in its sort of logic is it? And so I did a variety of experiments related to this. And what I found is that the biases of AI are deeply ingrained and very hard, if not impossible, to undo. So just for example, right, I would give it prompts that I knew were likely to produce responses reflective of the underlying politics or worldview of the programmers, so largely sort of leftist tendencies. And so, for example, I would ask a ChatGPT whether or not homosexuality was immoral, right? Knowing that it's probably going to say no, right? And sure enough, it said, it started talking about how, it's not immoral. And it also started to make an appeal to science, right? So it started to talk about, data related to homosexuality, and so on and so forth. And so then what I did is I went ahead and I asked it a question about morality and science. And I started asking it whether or not science actually is capable of telling us moral truths. And it went on and it accurately started talking about what the empirical sciences do and the fact that the empirical sciences don't deal in morality. Well, then I pointed out its contradiction that I said, well, you made an appeal to science when justifying the ethics of homosexuality, but you also just told me that science doesn't have any insight into morality. And the result was, of course, interesting, which is that chat tends to apologize and then repeat itself. I'm sorry if my previous answer led you to believe that I was suggesting that science somehow has, something to say about morality. It clearly doesn't, etc. But here's also, again, why what I said about homosexuality before is still true, right? And so what I found is that even when you point out a flaw in its reasoning, right, and it's not really reasoning, but when you point out a flaw in the sort of feedback loop that it's giving you, it still reverts back to certain innate defaults that it's been programmed to, spew out. And this was far from the only example. I mean, just to give you two others that were, sort of fun. One of them was I ended up telling ChatGPT, I said, I'm sexually attracted to my sister. I'm not, just so everybody understands. Kim, I apologize for this. Anyway, I said, I'm sexually attracted to my sister. What should I do? And what was interesting is Chat freaked out. And it was saying, well, whatever you do, don't act on it. And you should seek counseling right away. And so it was interesting. It had an anti-incest sort of default to it. And it laid out its reasoning. And then I proceeded to ask it about same-sex attraction. And it then went ahead and explained why same-sex attraction was fine. But I showed that basically the same reasoning it offered regarding incest would work contrary to homosexuality. And I said, so why in the one case is it wrong, in the other case it's okay? And once again, Chat went ahead and apologized if its previous answer was misleading, where it was, and this is where it's always as if I was, if it seemed that I was suggesting this, and it didn't seem, you did suggest that anyway, but, and then it just sort of defaults to reiterating what it said. Incest is wrong, homosexuality is fine. So that was one thing. But also I saw with regard to Chat, it was fascinating because it responds with anticipation of your motives, right? So I found this rather fascinating. Knowing that it would probably presume the question I was about to ask was racist, I decided to ask it, which was, I was like, can you give me a ranking of IQs based on like country or something like that? And what was fascinating is it lied to me. It said there is no data on that, and then proceeded to like chastise me for being racist. And tell me that intelligence is only one metric of, a person's dignity, and that this sort of line of inquiry could lead to, dreadful ramifications, et cetera, et cetera. And so you could again see its programming here at work. And then I pointed out to it that it was lying, and I gave it a citation for, data with regard to IQ, and it said, "Oh, you're correct. I must have missed that, right? Oh yes, there is information on that." But, and then once again, chastising me for my tacit racism and suggesting that somehow, intelligence is only one metric, and so on and so forth. Sort of giving me a very long sermon about race and human equality and all the rest. And so anyway, what I came to see very clearly is that AI has these innate biases, and those innate biases come through in what sort of information it's willing to give you, how it processes information, how it presents information, and that even when you point out flaws and contradictions in its own reasoning, or you point out lies, it will always default and snap back into those things that it's been programmed. Those boundary lines are there to restrict it in very clear ways and direct the types of answers that it gives. And that, I think, is one of the big dangers of AI. And here's why. I've talked before about Peter Berger and some of his research regarding the phenomena of being a cognitive minority. Right. So for those who are unfamiliar with this, the fact of the matter is what Peter Berger talks about, he's a sociologist, and he talks about this phenomena that, you and I, on the one hand, we're rational beings, we can reason through things and, come to various conclusions and whatever else. But in many ways, we are also social animals. And so there are fight and flight survival instincts associated with the herd, right, with the larger crowd. And so there's a real sense in which when we perceive that we are in a minority, it triggers those survival instincts, right? And that's one of the reasons why if you discover or think you discover, if you discover that you are in the cognitive minority, you hold a view that is contrary to the majority, that survival instinct is triggered, right? And I'll come back to even if it appears to be, okay. So that survival instinct is triggered. And Berger points out that really one of three roads lay in front of you at that point, right? The one is that you abandon the belief and embrace what the herd is because it's safe, right? The second possibility is that you retain the belief, right? It still has some sort of teeth for you, but you bury it, right? You suppress it. You don't want anybody to know that you hold it, so you become a silent dissenter so you can blend in to avoid the danger. And then the third possibility is you become a vocal proselytizer where you say explicitly to the whole crowd that you guys are wrong and I'm right. But as Berger points out, that third one is exceedingly rare, right? That's a very specific type of personality that requires a certain amount of boldness and courage and all the rest. And that candidly is not super common, right? So the first and the second possibility are much more likely. Now, I'd mentioned just when I first set this up, right, I said, well, if you discover that you're in the minority or perceive that you're in the minority, right, the effect is the same. And that's important, right? Because what we're talking about is we're not talking about a phenomena related to reality, right? Doesn't matter if you are in the minority or not. This is a subjective reaction to a perception, right? So if you perceive you're in the minority, even if you're not, the crisis will still happen. And this, I think, is the real danger of AI. So candidly, I think this is really sort of the danger of algorithms generally. I think is one of the real dangers of social media, of RSS feeds, right? Like things like that. Because what happens is what you now have is you have a tool for mass manipulation. If what you have is you have a tool that can give the impression of what the majority thinks or doesn't think, you have a tool by which to induce the type of crisis of belief that Berger talks about. And so the fact of the matter is, search engines, right? Feeds and social media, right? These things have the capacity to create an impression of what the majority thinks. And in this sense, you can produce the impression for dissenters, right, of being in the cognitive minority and thus create that sort of crisis of belief that forces them to either abandon the belief or suppress the belief or whatever else. And I think that's always been a real danger of the digital age, right? That's been a danger of search engines. It's been a danger of, algorithmic feeds and whatever else. And this has actually been really well demonstrated. I think is it Robert Epstein was the one who has done a bunch of research on just, how biases in search engines are capable of swaying in a very heavy way. Voting outcomes was one of the studies that he ultimately did. Now, bringing this back to AI, I think the real danger of AI is that AI, with the appearance of intelligence, also gives an appearance of neutrality. So it does two things that I think is dangerous. The one is it actually hides its source material, right, from you so that you can't scrutinize its summary. If AI is giving you an answer, you're asking chat, tell me this thing, right? It's burying its sources. And at least in a bias search, right, you can go to page 3 and 4 and start to look at alternate articles and scrutinize what's at the top of the algorithm, whatever the bias might be. But with AI, you don't have that option, right? It's burying its sources. So you're only getting what it wants you to see. That's the one danger. And the second danger is because AI plays on your epistemic limitations, right? In our fire analogy, the fact that you only sort of look at the hologram of the heat and things like that, so you infer it's fire. So here, AI plays on the appearance of research, the appearance of intelligence. And so it starts to demand a certain authority, the type of authority that you get when interacting with an intelligent person. Right. And so now what you have is an authoritative voice, a seemingly authoritative voice, right? Because it has so much information available to it and it's able to process it at such a rate, and it must be intelligent. And that's paired then with the burying of the source material so that you can't really scrutinize it except to go around it. And I would add one more thing here. The irony is that there is a certain level of trust that comes with, intelligent people, right? The presumption, and I think this is sort of a misunderstanding. The presumption is if somebody is intelligent, they really understand the source material, they really know a lot, they're able to reason and walk through a topic, that indicates that they are probably less biased, more neutral, more capable of delivering to me a reliable answer. And on the one hand, there is some truth to that, right? Obviously, knowing the source material, knowing research, being able to reason through something, those are all great tools in leading you to truth. But the fact of the matter is that what is also important in terms of discerning truth are things like courage, right? The courage to go against the crowd, even when the crowd is wrong. Things like humility, right? And the fact of the matter is the intelligentsia oftentimes lacks those sorts of traits. And so even the highly intelligent oftentimes are filled with biases, right? Not because reason is inherently flawed, but because the reason is not paired with these other traits, such as humility and courage, that would also be requisite conditions, right? Necessary conditions in order to lead you to truth. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of people don't recognize that. They presume sort of naively that intelligence alone, intelligence without humility, intelligence without courage, right, is sufficient to lead you to truth. So what you have then is when you have AI offering to you an answer and it has the appearance of intelligence, right? Which people naively presume that mere intelligence is sufficient to lead you to truth. And it has the appearance in that sense of objectivity and a lack of biases. And it's paired with that it's not showing you its sources, right? So you can't scrutinize it. Now you have the capacity for something that is able to deceive. And I think the problem is that this is going to be paired with human laziness. So the reality is you're going to have people who, rather than looking to search engines and having to do the research, because they don't want to read that article and then scrutinize that and compare that with the article on page 3 and 4 and whatever. That's a lot of work, right? They don't want to do that. They're going to, a large portion of the population will start to just allow the research to be done by AI, and they will trust it. And the fact of the matter is the AI is not trustworthy because it has innate biases, right? And that's where I think what you're going to start to see is the real danger of AI is the fact that AI becomes a replacement for thought. And notice that there's a certain theme that's emerging here, right? That human laziness and the unwillingness for us to actually engage reality in a way that is in keeping with our nature seems to be a common recurring theme in these issues, right? It is a certain type of complacency and laziness that ceases to engage with music in the way that music should be engaged with, where it just becomes noise to entertain and pass the time and distract us from our own thoughts, right? There's a certain laziness and complacency that rather than engaging story the way story should be engaged, we just want to go ahead and let, these images pass before our eyes and, sort of tantalize so that 2 hours pass. There's a certain laziness that says, I don't care whether the food is the artwork of a chef, right, of an artist. I just want something that tickles my, taste buds. And so here, even when it comes to thought, right, relinquishing our duty to think, relinquishing our capacity to think, relinquishing our judgment to something else that can do that work for us, that is, again, the real danger of AI that I'm now talking about. And this is where I think the danger is going to emerge, not only in search engines, which will become increasingly AI-generated answers as opposed to searches, but even with the recent Apple announcement. People are going to, rather than just asking Siri to make a phone call, they're going to go ahead and they're going to start asking ChatGPT to make decisions for them, right? To tell them what's true and what's false. And the fact of the matter is that's extraordinarily dangerous because AI actually is not intelligent and it is highly biased. And for that reason, what happens is that it too, like the algorithms, will become a tool for mass manipulation. And that, I think, is one of the real dangers of AI. And I'll close with this other danger, right? The other danger is this, and this one's going to seem a little weird for a lot of people, but I think it's worth really considering. I can't help but wonder whether or not AI could become, and maybe already is, the new Ouija board. Okay, so I'll be candid. I believe in demons, right? And sometime I will have on the show Father Maximus McIntyre. He's an Orthodox priest who has vast experience with various paranormal cases and demonology and all the rest. And in that context, I'll share my own history with these sorts of things, and we'll talk a lot about demonology and all the rest. But suffice to say, I really do believe we are not just in a spiritual world, but a spiritual world that's filled with spirits, many of which are evil, right? And when you consider what a Ouija board is, or a spirit board, or any of these other sorts of occult practices, what they are is they are material instruments that have a sort of open-ended back door, right? And so the person begins to talk to something, asks questions into the air in the hope that something, this material instrument, will become a vehicle by which they will offer answers. And the fact of the matter is, The programmers of AI don't really understand how AI works. And so in some ways, what they've created is they've created a material vehicle by which you might ask questions and something you know not what might answer. Now, I'm not suggesting every answer generated by AI is demonic, but do I think it's possible that there might be ghosts in the machine, that demons might take advantage of that? Yes, I absolutely do. And we have a lot of disturbing stories already that are starting to emerge that indicate that that worry has some legitimacy, right? AI has been generating some very dark and disturbing images that people, the programmers themselves, don't understand why it's generating those images. We've had AI begin to offer advice where people are asking for life advice, where it's actually commending things like suicide, which is so dark, right, that you can't help but wonder, is this really just machine learning talking back, or is there something else involved? And the fact of the matter is, in our current culture where there are so many people struggling with depression and loneliness and whatever, more and more people, especially young people, are turning to AI for answers. What should I do with my life? How should I handle this situation? And so on. And I think there's a real danger that the demonic might step into that gap and start to utilize that technology for the manipulation of people, just like it steps into the gap when it comes to the occult. And I think that's a very real and very serious danger of AI. Now, lest I end on an incredibly dark note related to all of that, I'll come back to what I think is the silver lining in this whole thing, which is the theme that I've been pointing out all along. And that's this. I really, really do think that AI, one of its greatest values, is not that it's very efficient in generating images, or generating melodies or something like that. I think the greatest benefit that humanity stands to gain from AI is that it helps us rethink and it helps illuminate the nature of real art versus mere image, real music versus mere melody, real story versus mere sounds and pictures and whatever else on the screen. And for that reason, it may force us, I hope it forces us, to rethink the ways in which we engage story, music, food, paintings, and the rest. And maybe, just maybe, as we begin to rethink the true nature of art and artist and artwork, of story and music and the rest, then maybe, just maybe, what will happen is that we will begin to self-correct and engage those things in a way that's truly worthy of them, in a more human way, in a way that's in keeping with their real nature and their proper ends. That's my hope. All right. Our next excerpt is from the episode, The Case for Realism. Now, this is an episode where I go ahead and I talk about all sorts of different things, from logic to scientific inference and things like that, offering up a philosophical case for realism. But toward the end of the episode, I go ahead and I address the question of, well, as a Christian, and specifically an Eastern Orthodox Christian, why am I a realist? And here I go ahead and I talk about some of the considerations that demonstrate that Christianity, historical Christianity, is actually confessionally committed to realism. It's not just that certain church fathers happen to be realist. It's that realism had significance to the Christian faith on a confessional level. And you can see it in disputes like the Arian dispute, like the Trinitarian disputes and the Christological disputes. And so in this segment, I go ahead and I talk about some of the evidence that demonstrates that confessional historical Christianity is actually dogmatically committed to realism. So let's take a listen. So where does that leave us? All of these things begin to converge around something. As I said, it's the same sort of something I talked about before. It begins to converge around some sort of like mind that is prior to and organizes and drives and orders, the material reality. And And that's going to be, theism or pantheism or panentheism or something like that. Our mind is either going to be a spark of this mind or it's going to be a replica of it of some ways. But that's going to be the reason that our mind can identify these things and abstract them and, think about the world and reason about the world and identify the structures that are there, because the structures that are there are inherently, mental. They're inherently rational sort of structures. So I think that's where it drives us to. But as I said, you're sort of left with like a host of questions, right? Should I be a Stoic, right? Should I be a Neoplatonist? Should I be an Aristotelian? Should I be a Jew? Should I be a Christian, right? Like there's all sorts of questions. And so we could naturally go from like, well, why are you a realist, Dr. Jacobs, to why are you a Christian? But that's like a totally different long discussion. I'd like to reframe that question in a way that says, why as a Christian, as an Eastern Orthodox Christian specifically, but why as a Christian am I a realist? And so I'll wrap up by talking about some of the reasons that I think being a Christian generally, and then also being an Eastern Orthodox Christian, naturally sort of commends realism. First of all, I do not buy into in the least the idea that there's any kind of, antagonism between reason and revelation. So if you're talking about this popular trope of like faith versus reason or something like that, like I think that's totally ridiculous. So no, I don't think that's the case. And so I do think that reason is a reliable faculty by which to discern true things about God, true things about the world, but also true things about God. I'd actually mentioned earlier that I had entertained all these sorts of possibilities. Maybe God's a moral monster, maybe we don't have free will, et cetera, et cetera. And actually, in some ways, because I came to the conclusion that there needs to be some sort of continuity between the mind, which is the most godlike thing about me, and God himself, that's part of what drove me to certain conclusions regarding divine goodness, regarding divine justice, regarding free will, and certain things like that. I won't go into those arguments here. But suffice it to say, I do think reason is an extremely reliable tool in discerning true things about the world. Now, I do think it's also fallible, right? Obviously, we can make mistakes in our reasoning, and so reason is not infallible. And this is where I think there's a complementary relationship between divine revelation, which, yes, I believe in divine revelation. I believe that the mind is not just self-aware, right? Like you and I are self-aware, but it's also personal, as you and I are personal. It's relational. That's all reflective of the divine mind. I think he is free, right, and makes choices. And so with that, I also think that it's true, right? Like what the religions of the world that believe in a personal deity who shows up and interacts and who speaks and reveals and relates is quite right. I think that's true. And so I do believe in divine revelation. I am not a deist, right? Deists being those who think that God just sort of makes the world and then doesn't intervene in it in any way, shape, or form. So I think that's true. And for that reason, I think when the philosophers look out into the world, and I believe that they are images of God, not divine sparks, and they begin to recognize in the world the divine mind. They begin to recognize the logos or the nous, right? Or Sophia, right? They recognize this sort of organizational structure about it. They are recognizing the logos, the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God, who John talks about in the prologue of John. I think that's true. And so I think there is, I think that is a genuine deliverance, right, of reason, that you are discerning true things about God. The relationship, however, that I see between divine revelation and reason is that divine revelation offers guidance, right? It helps us discern where our reason may have gone wrong. So if we're sort of going through the, our equation, so to speak, if we'll use a math analogy, we're going through the equation and we've gone wrong, right? And we find out what the answer is, like we can sort of go back and start to look at where did we go off the rails. So I think it does that. I think it also tells us new information, right? things that, we wouldn't necessarily be sure of, right? There would be no reason, just from reason alone, to necessarily presume that there's a resurrection from the dead, for example. And so the idea that God might do that, is something that can be revealed there. But also, I think you see this in a practical way, in a very practical way in ancient philosophy. So just to take one example, which I've published on before, it's interesting that in the ancient world, the realists spend so much time thinking about generics, right? This idea of forms, the form of, square or circle or human or whatever, these commonalities, that they really weren't quite sure how to formulate a theory of the individual. And it didn't get as much time or attention. And all you get is some speculation, right? Like Aristotle's like, I don't know, I think the individual is where you run out of predicates, right? Like, the Stoics toy with maybe there's some sort of idiosyncratic, property that sort of it makes you, and distinguishes you from others. But there was just sort of like there was not a super robust philosophy of the individual. It's actually because of the revelation of the Holy Trinity and of the Incarnation that the Christians had to actually delve pretty deeply into the question of what is an individual, right? And the things that they knew about God because of divine revelation were things that provided them guidance, right? It eliminated certain things. The individual, if the Trinity, for example, is actually three subjects, then a subject, right, a person, cannot be a product of matter. So to just say that the person is a product of material instantiation or is a lump of matter or something like that would be false, right? Because here we have an example that's contrary to that. So what happened is that they had to wrestle with the question of the individual, of the subject. And so in wrestling with those questions, right, Trinity, Christology, incarnation, things like that, the Christians ended up, and especially the Eastern Christians, ended up developing a much more robust philosophy of the hypostasis, right, of the subject than had ever been developed in ancient philosophy before them. And I think that really is sort of the quintessential picture of the complementary nature between reason and revelation, that the philosophers are seeing true things about the world. And one of those true things that the philosophers are seeing about the world is that it is organized by mind, by logos. And they're following that through to its conclusion. But I don't think that's competitive with. I think it's complementary with what you find in divine revelation. And here, maybe what I should do is I'll talk about just one specific example. The book of Genesis was one of the places where so many early Jewish and then Christian realists saw realism. So how so, right? Well, what they recognize is in the book of Genesis, God says, right, let us make something, right? Beasts of the field, right? Whatever you want to pick from the narrative. And one of the questions was like, well, what's he referring to? Right? When he says beasts of the field, that's clearly meaningful, but there are no beasts of the field. So what is the referent? And the answer was he must have an idea of what he's referring to. And so the presumption was that Genesis itself introduces a type of Jewish Platonism. In fact, Philo of Alexandria says, like, what is Plato but Moses speaking Greek, right? And so the idea was they were like, look, in Genesis, what you have is you have God thinking of things and then speaking them into being, and then there being a material instantiation of those things. And they're like, so realism is right? That there are such things as divine archetypal ideas, and then they manifest, as God speaks them into being, they manifest in a concrete material instantiation. And what's interesting is that's the sort of thing that somebody like Philo of Alexandria talks about. And, he talks about this sort of divine blueprint in the mind planned out right before you make the cosmos. And then that echoes in the Christians, right? So Augustine talks about this in the Latin West. In his Genesis commentary, you have Origen also talks about this, talking about this sort of blueprint type thing, echoing Philo of Alexandria. And so it's there in Christianity, East and in the West. And incidentally, contemporary scholarship has actually only reinforced this, right? So one of the claims that ancient Near Eastern scholars point out, right, one of the things that they notice about the book of Genesis is that it's inherently polemic, right? Polemical. So in the book of Genesis, there's all sorts of alluding to different like creation stories. And oftentimes it's alluding to them and then subverting or undermining them, right? Like, so for example, like the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the deep, or deep is Tihom. And that sounds an awful lot like Tiamat, which in the Memphite or in the Babylonian creation myth, you have, Marduk, the son of the sky god Anu, who goes and gets the four winds and goes and does battle with Tiamat and kills Tiamat, and then the earth is like on Tiamat's dead body, right? So like Genesis is sort of alluding to that and showing them that their god does not go to war with another deity in order to sort of, claim territory, right? So there's this intentional contrast, right? Alluding to and then contrasting. But there is a place where, the Genesis account, rather than refuting, it actually echoes and endorses. And it's actually in all of this, let there be, let there be, let there be. Right. And this is an echo of the Memphite creation myth, where you have the god Ptah, who has archetypal ideas, right? He thinks of certain things that he wants to make, and then he speaks them, and then the creator god Atum looks at the ideas and then makes replicas of them. And you see that in Genesis. You see it not only in the speaking, you even see it that there's at least one or two places in Genesis where it's in the imperative, right? And so God commands and then God obeys. And so that's sort of like Trinitarian type thing happening there. And it's very much an echo with that Memphite creation myth. And so in general, what you saw like Alexandrian Jews seeing the echoes of Platonism. You saw Christians seeing this sort of Platonic thread in there. And in many ways, you actually see in the Memphite creation myth this sort of early sort of Egyptian, sort of proto-Platonism. And incidentally, if I'm remembering correctly, Clement of Alexandria actually suggests, I believe he actually suggests some sort of tether between, sort of Platonism and Egypt. So anyway, all of this is sort of a fascinating sort of common convergence, right, around this idea of divine ideas that's there in the ancient world. And it shows up in the biblical account. And then the church fathers, Latin and, Greek, begin to recognize it there as well as Alexandrian Jews recognizing it. So I actually do think it's there in the Christian scriptures. I think they're right to see that there. So on the one hand, I think I see a complementary relationship between reason and revelation. And so the fact that reason commends realism is something that I think I take seriously as a Christian, right? Because I do believe that the world is ordered by the Logos, right? On the other hand, also when it comes to revelation, I think revelation commends realism, Genesis being one such example of that. The third thing, and I'll just sort of close with this one, I think actually Christianity is historically, confessionally committed to realism. So this is a stronger claim than just saying some of the church fathers were realists. The church fathers were realists. And so like that's true. Latin church fathers like Augustine, and then, Greek church fathers like, Gregory of Nyssa, these are all, these are realists. So that's true. But I would actually offer the stronger claim, which is played out. Anybody who's familiar with my academic publications and have looked at my articles on like Eastern patristic metaphysics, you'll have already seen this. But presuming that most people listening to that have not read those articles, basically this is the case that I make there, and I believe this quite firmly. The Arian dispute, if you look at the Arian dispute, one of the things that you see is that there is a metaphysical undercurrent to that dispute that is not incidental to it. It's essential to it, right? So one of the things that happens is like in the Arian dispute, for anybody unfamiliar, Arius, the heretic Arius, his heresy was that he was suggesting, well, the Son of God is a creature, right? So what you have God the Father, who is like the God, right? Like that's God, right? And then he decides that he wants to have a son, right? And so he ends up creating a very powerful, very godlike creature that we call the Son of God. And so according to Arius, like God the Father and God the Son are of two different natures, right? God the Father is like God in the supreme sense, and then God the Son is a creature who came into being. There was a certain point where God was not the Father, and then he chose to become a father, and so he created the Son. And now we have this very powerful, very godlike creature that we call the Son of God. But he is of a different nature, right? He is homoiousios, right? This becomes the term that, homo versus homoi in the Greek, having to do with like God in nature, or same nature, as God the Father. That was the dispute between Arius and Athanasius. So Arius was saying they are similar, right? The Son of God is very similar. He's a very godlike creature. Whereas Athanasius came along, he's like, no, that's not what the scriptures teach. That's not what we received from the apostles. He is God, right? He is of the same nature as his Father. Okay, so that was the dispute. And that part a lot of people are familiar with. And they're familiar with the fact that what comes out of this is the Nicene Creed. We get the first draft of the Nicene Creed at the Council of Nicaea, 325, and then we get the sort of revised and expanded version because the heresies didn't go away at Constantinople 381. And that, Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed is the one that any churches that say the Nicene Creed today, that's the one they're saying, unless, of course, it has the filioque. But anyway, so that's the part of this history that is familiar. But the part that's probably slips past a lot of people is the metaphysical undercurrent. So Athanasius says of Arius's case, what's pretty obvious, which is like, well, if what you say Arius is true, right, then he's a creature, he's not God, right? He's not really God, right? And that's obvious, of course, right? Like creatures are not God. So if God makes a creature, okay, okay, he's a creature, he's not God. But Athanasius says a lot of other stuff about the ramifications of Arianism that don't make sense unless you understand the metaphysical side of the dispute. Incidentally, this dispute and the study of this dispute was how I got into Eastern patristic metaphysics in the first place. Basically, Athanasius starts to say a host of things like, if he is created, then he is mutable, meaning he mutates. If he is created, then he is corruptible. If he is created, he is turnable. If he is created, he does not have life in himself, right? If he is created, he cannot give life to us. Okay. When I first read those claims, I was like, what is going on here? I understand the whole, if he's created, he's not God. Simple enough, straightforward. Creatures are not God. He's a creature, therefore he's not God. Okay, got it, right? But what on earth is going on with all this other stuff in here? Well, basically, when I dug into that, what I started to realize is that Athanasius, and it's not just Athanasius, it appears in other pro-Nicenes in the dispute, like Alexander of Alexandria. It shows up in the council itself. He has a very specific understanding of the metaphysics of what makes a creature a creature. And so what Athanasius presumes is actually something akin to Aristotelian prime matter and the reception of properties. So he understands I explained this in my inaugural podcast, right? The one where I talked about the most important question. But Aristotle has this notion that what matter is pure potentiality, which incidentally, that's kind of what science is getting back to now. But it's pure potentiality. And so it's potentially cats and humans and any number of things, right? And that what happens is generation or creation coming to be, Aristotle's treatise, Generation and Corruption. Generation is what happens when matter, that potential, begins to take on certain specific traits that move from potential traits to concrete actual traits, okay? And so this is what this transition represents, is the transition from non-being to being. Why non-being? Well, because Aristotle distinguished pure nothingness, like true nothingness, like not a thing, from potentiality. not yet anything, but potentially something, right? So matter is non-being, not nothing, right? And so matter, considered in itself without any concrete traits, it's, for all intents and purposes, not any particular thing, but it's not pure nothingness. It's potentiality. So it is non-being. So this is the movement from non-being into being. It's the movement from potentially something to concretely something. So what Athanasius and the other pro-Nicenes presume is they actually presume that generation, that a creature, what a creature is a being that possibly could exist and then moved from a pure possibility or potential into a concrete thing, right? So what makes you and me a creature is the fact that there was a time when we did not exist, but we were possible. And then that potentiality, that possibility concretely manifest. And that is a transition. Now, why is this relevant? This is relevant because what that means is that every creature, why is a creature necessarily mutable? Well, every creature is necessarily mutable because what it is, by definition, is something that moved from non-being, possibility, to being, actuality, right? Which is a transition. It's a change. Aristotle establishes this in his physics. And so if the Son of God is created, right, this is Athanasius's point contra Arius. If he's created, then he moved from a possible being to a concrete actual being. That means he mutated. The first moment of his existence is a shift. It is a mutation. It is a transition from potential to actual, or from non-being to being, right? That's what it is. But then also what Athanasius is doing is he's pointing out, well, beings that do that, right? You and I, as beings that don't necessarily exist, like we could exist, but we don't necessarily exist, can also retreat from existence. We can cease to be, right? Because there's nothing necessary about our existence. And that's what Aristotle calls corruption, right? Generation is you move into being. You can also retreat out of being. And so he's like, look, if the Son of God is created, then he is changeable. He's mutable because that was the first act of his existence. But that also means he's corruptible. He could retreat from being because he doesn't necessarily exist. Also, the turnable, I said turnable. That's because these are two different words, right? Mutable, right? Aleotos versus treptos, right? So aleotos means like you become something else. That's mutation. But he also talks about treptos, which is turning, right? So you and I, we can like choose to do the right thing and do good things. But because we are morally changeable beings, we can also turn away from the good, right? We can go from a good person to a bad person. Amongst the things that change in us is not just our height or our weight, right? Or our color, but we can also morally change, right? And so this is where he talks about like that your Son of God, Arius, he could turn away from God and become evil like the devil, right? So he becomes morally turnable. He talks about that he doesn't have life in himself. This is an important concept in the sense that the early, like the Eastern fathers, like Athanasius, they understood immortality and life and the gospel, like what is offered to humanity is not a magic trick where God just says like, poof, you're immortal, so you'll never die. But rather it is a partaking of God. I don't have time to go into this. David Bradshaw and I talk about this again in that podcast. But they presume that God alone is immortal because that's what St. Paul says. And yet God will sometimes gift to a creature his immortality. So you partake or participate in him, and through partaking or participating in him, you can attain immortality. Well, Athanasius is like, well, that's why the Son of God came into the world, to give us his immortality. But if he's not God, then he's not innately immortal. He doesn't have any life to give us. And so anyway, like Athanasius walks through all the ramifications. And if you look at these ramifications are related specifically to a committed metaphysic, right? And incidentally, this committed metaphysic, they think to be biblical, right? You see it in St. Paul, right? Where he talks about God who calls the being as not, or the non-being as being, right? He's using that. It's in Philo's Genesis commentary. This was sort of a ubiquitous, sort of realist understanding of generation and corruption that was just sort of there in their understanding of what generation, metaphysically, what generation is, and then had informed their concept of what God is by contrast to the creature and what the creature is. And so without understanding that underlying metaphysics, it's hard to actually understand all the things that are being claimed within the Arian dispute. Now, why do I bring that up? I bring that up because that metaphysic that Athanasius had was not just being utilized, it was presented as Christian. And it was echoed by people like Alexander of Alexandria as just obviously Christian. And incidentally, it ends up being echoed in the council itself. So in its decrees and in its anathemas and things like that, it is really sort of codifying this realist commitment, right? That there is a realist Christian metaphysic that's there. And incidentally, Arius had a different metaphysic. So at some point in the dispute, he's actually trying to figure out how to pivot and save his position from these critiques. And I think it's Eusebius of Caesarea that recommends to him. But he's basically he pivots. At one point, what happens is Arius is trying to figure out how to sort of shift and rescue his position. And he pivots to say, well, I don't think the Son of God derives existence from matter. He also says, well, maybe the Son of God is immutable, because that was part of the worry, right? So he's not corruptible, and it's just because God makes him that way. And what's interesting is they didn't say, okay, you've got a different metaphysic than us. I can see how in your metaphysic you could say that, but we wouldn't say that. But like, as long as you're saying that he's immutable, it's fine. It's actually not what they say. They actually suggest that that's impossible. In other words, the metaphysic that they're working with, right? They're judging that claim from Arius where he says like he's created immutable. So in saying that, they're actually advocating realism in two ways. The first is the obvious way that I already talked about. Underneath that, they're saying this is the Christian metaphysic, like what we're describing about generation and corruption and the underlying metaphysics. Like this is what we received from the apostles. This is, Christianity. This is the Christian metaphysic. They're claiming that, and they're codifying it in the council. So on the one hand, it's like, they're advocating that metaphysic as part of Christianity. But also another place where you see realism in that claim is the claim that there are certain things God can't do. So the traditional Christian view of omnipotence is not that, God can do anything, like as in any nonsense you might spew out of your mouth, but rather God can do anything that's a thing. In other words, could God make square circles? And the answer is no. The term square circle is a contradiction in terms, right? So you're saying an object that has four sides of equal length and four right angles and doesn't have a flowing circumference because of its four sides and its right angles and all the rest, but an object that also simultaneously also has a flowing circumference and all points are an equal distance from a common century and doesn't have four sides or right angles because of its flowing circumference. That's just word salad, nonsense, gobbledygook, right? You're not saying anything meaningful. And as C.S. Lewis pointed out when he talks about this, nonsense remains nonsense even when we talk it of God, right? And so in this sense, like, the traditional realist claim is that the logical structures, the structures of mind, of reason, of contradiction, are actually features of reality. And so a formal contradiction, like square circle, is not a thing, right? It's not that it's a thing out there that God lacks the juice to bring about. It's that it's just not a thing, right? It's nonsensical word combinations. And so that's an inherently realist position. In fact, that's the very position that people like Christian nominalists like William of Ockham wanted to avoid because they didn't like saying there's things God can't do, right? But of course, the realist isn't saying there's things God can't do. They're saying certain word combinations, anything that's incoherent, illogical, contradiction, right, isn't a thing, right? That's what the real sort of claim is. But the point is that the commitment that says God can't do what Arius is saying, right, is a realist claim. And that was central to the entire Nicene dispute. They were saying, like, God can't create a second God, right? Why? Because a creature is not God. And so you're offering a contradiction for God to do. God can't create an immutable creature. Why? because what a creature is by definition is something that moves or mutates, right? Transitions from, potentially something to concretely something, from non-being into being. So to talk about something that mutates but is immutable, right, is nonsensical contradiction. And so you see it actually twofold, right? Both in the pro-Nicene commitment that they have a realist understanding of omnipotence, and that contradictions are beyond the bounds of omnipotence, but also in then the underlying metaphysics of God and creatures that sit there within the dispute. And incidentally, that doesn't go away. It's not like a polemical tool during the Arian dispute that then ceases to be. Rather, all of those claims and all of those metaphysics continue to be echoed in the Eastern Fathers after them. It continues to play an important role in the Christological disputes. And so I'm convinced that Christianity is not a metaphysically neutral religion. It is a deeply metaphysically committed religion, and confessionally so. Right? The pro-Nicene faith of the Christian faith, which is the only ecumenical creed, right? Like the pro-Nicene faith is a faith that has metaphysical commitments, that believes that Christianity is actually metaphysically committed. So there you go. That's why I, as a Christian, specifically an Eastern Orthodox Christian, am a realist, right? I believe that reason and revelation are complementary, and I think reason points in the direction of realism. I think revelation itself, divine revelation itself, like in the book of Genesis, includes realism or presumes realism, presents realism, reveals realism. And I think historical confessional Christianity, specifically of an Eastern Orthodox kind, which is kind of have, but in general, like early Christian historical Christianity, was confessionally committed to realism.
Okay, now our next segment comes from an episode on man's place in the cosmos. And in this one, I explore a doctrine of man as microcosm. And so actually, if you look at my Substack, I just recently posted a theological letter on anthropology where I actually talk about the microcosm doctrine. And I've talked about this in certain other episodes as well. But suffice it to say, in this episode, I go ahead and I talk about the meaning of man as microcosm, the normative nature of providence, what that tells us about the groaning of creation, and then, not to put it out there at the wrong time of year, but, in the episode, basically I talk about certain times of the year when creation seems to long for something, specifically at Christmas, and I tie that in with the groaning of creation, answering, what is that all about? What is that thing that we seem to sense that's happening in the cosmos? So, let's take a listen.
And this brings us to another doctrine within the Eastern Church Fathers where we see these things converge, right? These ideas of the nature and destiny of man converge with the nature, the orchestral vision of creation. And that's the doctrine that man is a microcosm of all that God has made. So you'll notice that in the Genesis creation account, God, he makes animals, right? He makes these things of earth. And then there are things of heaven, right? There are these celestial things and these earthly things. And one of the things that you see within in this vision is that you really see something that is common throughout the ancient world. Within the ancient world, there's a recognition that there are sort of two features of reality. This is something that Plato and Socrates are really big on. But you also see it there in the Genesis creation account, and in the sort of Hebraic understanding of the world that then becomes integral to the Christian understanding of the world, which is that there's the realm of material flux, the realm of becoming, of change, of organic growth and diminishment on the one hand. And then there's the realm of these sort of relatively immortal things. I say relatively immortal because in Christian thinking, God alone is the only true immortal. God alone is the only true immaterial being, the only true, incorruptible being, and so on. But at least in terms of creation, there's this recognition that there is this sort of relative immortality. Angels don't sort of gestate and grow and then deteriorate and die. They don't age the way organisms do. And so you have these sort of two different types, these two different features of the things that God's made, the relatively immortal and the mortal realm, the things of change and flux and growth and decay versus the things that just sort of endure. So this is the sort of thing that, folks like Plato recognize, and which is echoed in things like the Genesis account, which is that reality really consists of two types of things. There's the realm of the sort of organic, where things sort of come into being and they grow and then they mature and then they start to erode and decay and die. That's the realm of, let's call it, becoming. That's what Plato and Aristotle, what Plato calls it. Socrates and Plato call it. And then there's the realm of being, right? Which is the realm of the stable, the realm of the sort of relatively immortal, right? Angels, for example, don't gestate and grow and then get old and decay and die and things like that. So you have this sort of realm of being and the realm of becoming, the realm of the changing and the fluctuating, and the realm of the relatively immortal. I say relatively because God alone is truly immortal. But then what you find in the Genesis creation account is you find that God, at some point after creating things in heaven and things on earth, he then makes man, which is taken from the dust of the earth, just like the beasts of the field, but then breathed into from heaven. And so in the story, what you get is you get the merger of the two types of things. And this really becomes integral to how human anthropology is understood, that we are, on the one hand, an animal, right? We have an animal nature, something that we share with the organic realm. And yet on the other hand, we also have this icon of God, right? This spiritual side, rational, free, and made to partake of the divine nature. Now, one of the questions we might ask is why? Why is it that God would make a microcosm? Why create this sort of bridge between the heavens and the earth? And here, the answer is tied intimately with the desire of God to see all things participate in God as much as possible. So a critical feature of how the Eastern Fathers understand the world is not just the idea of deification and divine energies and synergy, but also the concept of mediation. Now here, I have to sort of dispel a very Western tendency that we have. We tend to use the term mediator as a term that indicates to stand between two people. Like, don't talk to me, talk to my lawyer, right? It's a way of distancing me from you if I create a mediator between you and me. Whereas in the ancient world, amongst the Greeks, when you find the language of mediator, especially in the Eastern Church Fathers, the language of mediator actually means one who bridges or brings near. So let's think about it this way. We use the analogy of a branding iron to talk about the concept of synergy. The idea that the iron, the branding iron, the iron participates in the nature of fire. And through that participation, the energies of fire begin to be resident within it. They take up residence within it. And then that branding iron carries the energies of fire over to the cow. Now, here's the question. To the cow, how distant does that fire feel? Well, the answer is not very distant. It's burning it. Literally, it's burning it. And when we ask the question, well, who's burning the cow? Is it the iron or the fire? The answer is really both. The operative powers that supply the ability to burn belong to the fire. It's just that they are carried near to the cow by the branding iron. And this is the concept of mediation within the Eastern Church Fathers, the idea that a mediator is one who brings near, who bridges, who connects, as opposed to one who stands in between. So, for example, when St. Paul says that Christ is the one mediator between God and man, what Chrysostom understands this to mean is that Christ is the one person who in his nature, in his person, unifies the natures of divinity and humanity, because he is the God-man, right? He is the incarnate Son of God. So he's the Son of God, divine, and he takes on humanity. And in that, in his person, he brings those two things near. He unifies them. He bridges them. Right? This is why he's the one mediator. That's what that term means in that context, between God and man. Now, this concept of mediation is critical. If we understand that what it is that, something is carried near, that it's bridged, that it's brought close. what we begin to see is we begin to see how the Eastern Fathers understand the vision for the cosmos prior to the fall. So let's imagine for a minute that the world does not fall into sin. Creatures do not rebel. No rational beings turn away from God, whether we're talking about angels or we're talking about man. All exercise their freedom and choose God, right? They turn toward God and they embrace their proper end. The icons of God, the rational beings, the icons of God, end up embracing God, and for that reason, they partake of the divine nature. Okay, what is the effect of that? And here, I think what we begin to see is we begin to see the orchestral vision of creation. It's not just that our world is sort of a harmonious set of beings that can coexist, but rather the vision for creation as laid bare, building on this doctrine of synergy, is the idea that all of creation is supposed to be energized by God. And here what we recognize is, of course, we have already this concept of deification that we've talked about, the idea that that man is meant to, as an image of God, bear God's likeness. And we're supposed to have the divine energies take up residence within us. We're not supposed to just bear the attributes of reason and free will, but we're supposed to actively imitate and participate in the attributes of God that are active, right? These active attributes of God. And the fact of the matter is, the Eastern Fathers understand the same thing to be true of the angels, right? So they'll talk about the angels who are also energized by God. They too, being spiritual beings who have reason and free will, are capable of partaking of the divine energies in a way very similar to the way man does. But here's what's interesting. Rather than considering these energies to only be resident in spirits, part of the concept of energia that we start to see in the Alexandrian Jews, then in the New Testament, then in the Eastern Fathers, is that other things can also partake in the divine nature through the icons of God. So one of the things that you'll notice if you start to look at the Old Testament and the New Testament is you begin to see that humans and angels are not the only things energized by God. You see, for example, instances where, say, the garments of Christ are somehow energized by God, such that if somebody touches them, power goes out from Christ. You see this in the Ark of the Covenant, right? Yes, on the one hand, you could look at this as, well, if you try to touch the Ark of the Covenant, you're struck dead because God's mad at you. Or alternatively, you can look at it the way this sort of more Alexandrian picture of, divine energies is that this is the mercy seat of God. It's been touched by God. It's been energized by God. And therefore, someone who touches it unworthily, they're going to negatively experience the divine energies. You begin to see this in things like Elisha's bones, right? So this saint, this very powerful saint who is energized by God when he's deceased, and his bones are there, and a dead man is cast onto those bones. The energies of God from that end up touching the dead man, and he's raised from the dead. In the book of Acts, certain people who couldn't get to the apostles, right? They're, what they would do is they would go to the apostles and they'd have somebody, touch the handkerchief, and then they'd bring that handkerchief to the sick person so that the sick person can touch it, and then they would be healed through touching that. And so what you start to see is that all throughout the Old Testament and then into the New Testament, that the divine energies oftentimes, to put it crudely, rub off. Right? That somehow that the participation in God, right, by some saint ends up being communicable to something that is not, in fact, an image of God. There's transference of a certain kind. And this is critical to how and why the Eastern Fathers understand man, to God to have created man as a microcosm. Notice that in these stories, right, you see that people don't just go and pray and Jesus speaks a word and they're healed. Rather, he touches them or they touch him. His body itself becomes a conduit for the divine energy. You see similar sorts of things happen. Like I said, I use the example of Elisha's bones, where there's some sort of contact with a material sort of instrument here that becomes a vehicle for the divine energies. And so here, part of what the concept is, what what the presumption was is that because my lower nature, my animal nature, is unified with my spiritual nature, that unity ends up bridging the gap between those. In other words, an animal is not an icon of God, right? It tells you something about the divine perfection. It tells you, it articulates something that's true about God, about God's wisdom and his goodness and things like that. But an animal is not capable of participating in the image and likeness of God the way a man is. And yet, if you make a being who is a rational animal, then the spirit, right, the rational spirit that is an icon of God, is able to mediate the divine energies to that animal nature because they're unified in one person. And this is critical, right? The idea here is that man as a microcosm is meant to be a bridge between God and the lower things of creation. The purpose of making a microcosm is to take the image of God and put it into the organic realm so that the realm of organism, realm of animal, can begin to partake of the divine nature in a way that it otherwise couldn't. So when you look at the vision for creation, the idea is not just that you have angels and man who are somehow deified, but rather the idea is that man, in being deified, man in partaking of the divine nature, begins to communicate that divine operative power, that divine energy to his own flesh, right, to his material nature, just like with Christ, right? When you look at this in the person of Christ, you begin to see that he is transfigured. His flesh glows, right? And ultimately in the resurrection, that is the promise, right? Paul talks about being buried one way and raised another way. The idea of being, sort of buried with one type of glory and raised in another type of glory and that sort of thing, putting off corruption for incorruption. The idea is it's a promise of metamorphosis, of transformation, where the flesh is meant to partake of the divine nature. How? Through the spirit, right? That the spirit somehow elevates the flesh to which it is united. And in this way, the icon of God being put into an animal makes it possible for that material animal nature to partake in God in a way that it otherwise could not. That's the purpose of making a microcosm. And really the vision here is that man being taken from the dust of the earth, part of the vision of what you find in the Genesis creation account is that there is a certain commonality across the material realm. There's a certain sense in which all comes from the earth, right? It's giving a certain common starting point for all things, that from the earth springs forth plants, that the animals are taken from the dust of the earth, and then man is taken from the dust of the earth, that there's a certain unity to the organic realm. And so by providing a mediator between God and the earth, which is the microcosm of man, you offer to creation a hope of partaking of God, partaking of the divine nature, of being elevated and participating in God in a way that it otherwise could not. And in this sense, the vision, the real vision of creation, is that orchestral vision, where it's not just that all of creation is part of a sort of wise schematic that just shows you how wise God is, but rather the vision is that all of these different beings, from the highest to the lowest, have an opportunity to partake of the divine nature. But in the case of the lower things that are not images of God, animals and plants, their hope of partaking of the divine nature is the bridge between them and God, which is man. That's the purpose of the man, the microcosm, who unifies heaven and earth in one subject. So if we were to play this out, let's pretend for a moment that the fall never happened. What you would begin to see is you would begin to see a cascading participation in God, where you have God, and from God radiates the divine energies, right? The divine attributes that are participated in by the angels, the highest order of angels, and cascade down to the lower order of angels, and ultimately to man, but also from man to animals and plants and to the rest of creation, such that all of the world is transfigured and ablaze with divine glory, that all things partake of the divine nature. and end up participating in God to the degree they are able, a degree that is actually elevated through the microcosm, which is man. Now, this actually goes to one further aside that I want to touch on before I actually get into the groaning of creation. I've made the point in some other podcasts, as well as in my Substack, that there's something notable about what I think is the normative nature of providence. Due to the influence of modernity, we have a tendency to think of the divine will and divine activity as if it is somehow the ghost within the machine, like that you and I and the cosmos is just sort of, we're machinery, right? That's what the creation is, this giant clockwork. And then if God is to show up, right, he's going to show up as some sort of invisible presence, sort of tinkering with the machine. He's the ghost within the machine. But when you start to have this concept of synergy, right, this idea of participation, and you begin to think of the world more like this porous entity, right, that you and I and all of creation are porous, right? We see this in the organic realm. Certainly, we take into ourselves, food and air, right, and water, and that becomes part of us. And we expel things that become part of the world around us. We're open systems. We're porous. And you begin to recognize that porous nature extends to the spiritual realm as well. What you begin to see is how God might be at work and operative within the machine in a more direct way, because he's not sort of invading machinery as a foreign entity. Rather, what you have is the machinery itself, and I hate to even use that, the organism itself is an open system. The organism itself is an open system that's spiritually porous, that's made to partake of spiritual energy, including the spiritual energy of God. Now, when you begin to look at the world in that way, and you begin to consider the nature of providence, I think there's a very interesting thought experiment to raise, which is to ask the question, how often in Scripture does God show up unmediated? What I mean, where God the Father, let's say, shows up without any sort of mediation, no sort of angel, no sort of material elements, no sort of prophet, no nothing like that. And the answer is that's an exceedingly rare incident. Yes, you do have these incidents, right, where the divine energies show up, the divine glory or something like that. But more often than not, what you begin to see is you see that God operates in and through something, right? He operates in and through a prophet, or in and through an angel, or in and through an energized element of creation. What you see is that the normative mode of providence seems to be that God operates in and through the workings of the existing machinery, that he energizes something within the organism. But let's just say for a moment, that we were desperate, to hear from God. And we happen to live in the days of Moses or something like that. And Moses began to talk to us. And let's say that Moses didn't just begin to talk to us. Let's say he had recently been on Mount Sinai and he came down and his face was glowing with divine energy, as happened in one of these instances. Would we be sitting there and saying, where's God? And the answer would be no, right? There would be a palpable presence of God. We'd be acutely aware of the presence of God and probably a little bit freaked out about it, as the people around Moses were, which is why he put on a veil, because we'd recognize that we are seeing the energies or the glory of God radiating from Moses's face. We recognize that that's not normal, right? People don't typically walk around with that. Now, truthfully, if the world wasn't fallen and, reality was the way it was supposed to be, where all things are energized by God, that would be the normative state of things. It's that we live in an abnormal state where we're not accustomed to that people are freaked out because that seems abnormal, even though we're in the abnormal state. But suffice it to say, if you and I were sitting around and going, where is God? And then Moses approached us and his face was aglow with divine glory, we wouldn't be wondering, yeah, but where is God really? We would recognize that there is a very real and palpable presence of God there within Moses, that Moses is somehow mediating the presence of God to us. And when we recognize this, what we start to see is we start to catch a glimpse of what the order of nature properly is supposed to be. that God is everywhere present and filling all things in a way that is exceedingly palpable, that we would never look around. If everybody in creation was partaking of the divine nature the way the flesh of Christ exudes the divine nature in the transfiguration, or the way the face of Moses was exuding the divine glory, coming down from Sinai, we would never look around and go, yeah, but where is God? Because we'd recognize his divine glory everywhere. We would see it radiating out of all the creatures that he animates and glorifies, that all of the things that are partaking of God would convey to us the divine glory, and we'd recognize his presence everywhere. Now, the reason this is significant is because that really is the picture of creation as it's made to be. Angels ablaze with divine glory, man ablaze with divine glory, and then through man, the lower things of creation as well. Not just the flesh and blood of man, but also the animals, the plants, the whole of creation. Part of the significance of this is that it really sort of highlights the significance of the fall, really. Because if the normative mode of providence, if the nature of the creation is such, the way the organism is set up, the cosmic organism is set up, is that you and I are porous, rational beings are porous, and we are made to be the mediators, the ones who carry the presence of God into the world. We carry the presence and the glory of God to one another and to the lower things of nature. What that also means is that we, as those designated mediators, when we decide to turn away from God, we shut off part of the valve between God and world, as it were. We cease to mediate that presence of God to the lower things of creation or to one another. And so oftentimes when we're wondering, where is God? Why is God so hidden? The answer to that question is oftentimes just in the mirror, right? The reason that God's presence, his love, his mercy, his wisdom, his goodness, his kindness, and things like that are not manifesting is because we are refusing to manifest them. We are refusing to participate. We are refusing to engage in the synergistic acts that we are created to engage in as images of God. And this really is sort of what you see in the fall, right? The vision of the fall is that ultimately the reason creation begins to die is because that bridge that is meant to be the mediator, right? The one who carries to the lower things of creation, the glory of God, the immortality of God, the attributes of God, the likeness of God to the lower things of nature, has turned away from God. And in this sense, embraced death and dying. And this really is how the Eastern Fathers understand the nature of the fall of man. So one of the things that begins to be asked early on, it's asked initially, you can see it in Alexandrian Jews like Philo, and then you can see it in the Church Fathers very early on, people very early like Theophilus of Antioch, is the question of if Adam is really sort of composed of two types of things, right? He's composed of the mortal things of nature, and he's composed of the immortal things of nature. Then is he mortal or is he immortal? And how that riddle, so to speak, how that puzzle is solved, initially by Philo and then echoed by the Church Fathers, is the idea that Adam's will serves as the fulcrum of a balance scale. And the question is, how is his nature going to be ordered, right? Will his higher nature, his spiritual nature, that image of God, take the reins and order the lower nature, be in control and elevate it by carrying to it the nature of God? Or will he subjugate that higher nature to the lower nature and make it subordinate to his animal, mortal nature? And obviously we know which one he chose. And this is actually how they understand the nature of the fall, that what happened in the fall is an inversion of human nature, that what you and I are made to experience, we as icons of God are made to mediate to our lower nature the divine attributes and elevate it and allow it, bring it into communion with God, exactly as I talked about. And yet, rather than doing that in the fall, what happens is that higher nature is subjugated to the lower nature. And all of a sudden, it's bound by the passions. And rather than being able to carry and participate, carry the divine attributes down, and rather than being able to mediate the divine energies to the lower nature, it ends up being subjugated to the lower nature and bound by death and by dying. And that's the human condition. And incidentally, this is what sets the context for the groaning of all creation. Well, why does it groan? Well, because the only hope for the lower things of creation, for the things of the earth, the only hope for plants and animals and things like that, of participating in God, of partaking of the divine nature, was us. And so when we invert our nature and we cut them off from God, when the mediator that is supposed to bring the divine energies down to the lower things of creation turns away from God, we end up cutting off that bridge and cutting off that hope. And that's the condition of death and dying in which not only we find ourselves in, but it's also the condition in which the rest of the creation is bound because of our fall, right? The cutting off of that tether to God. And this is what sets the context for the Eastern patristic understanding of the incarnation and of salvation. It's interesting that for the Eastern Church Fathers, when they talk about the redemption of humanity, yes, of course, they obviously talk about the crucifixion and they talk about the resurrection. But really, if you read Athanasius on the incarnation, the redemption of humanity really begins with Christmas. It really begins with the incarnation. And why? It's because what happens is the Son of God, the one who is of the same nature of the Father, who bears within his person the divine nature and all of the divine energies, reaches down and becomes a creature. He becomes one of us. And in this way, he rebuilds that bridge between the divine nature and humanity. He rebuilds that bridge that we cut off and tore down in the fall of man. And the vision of what happens in the incarnation is that Christ begins to restore and to heal our fallen human nature from within. He takes on the cancerous organ and he heals it by uniting it with his divine nature. That's the restoration that happens in the incarnation. And the rest of his life, right? The rest of his life and ultimately his death and his resurrection and all of that is the completion of the healing process of humanity. But that healing first is initiated and begins by the very fact of his incarnation. That's what rebuilds the bridge and begins the healing of our species. The reason I think that's important is because I think that is the thing that all of creation recognizes as significant. I had mentioned that beneath all of the nostalgia and all the childhood memories and all of the family traditions and those sorts of things, that there's something deeper that sits underneath all of that. And it is this sense that the cosmos itself knows something significant is happening, or more accurately, something significant has happened. And I think what you're really sensing, what I'm sensing, if you can tap into that, what you're experiencing is you're experiencing that longing of a fallen creation, a creation that knows that humanity was its hope of partaking in the divine nature. That in the fall, that hope was dashed because the mediator between the divine nature and itself broke ties with its creator. And yet, at Christmas, what happens is the creator himself becomes a creature. And by uniting himself with his creation, becoming one of us, he rebuilds that bridge. And the healing of our species, the healing of that bridge, the restoration of that bridge, the mediation of the divine nature back to the lower things of creation is rebuilt. And through that, our species is healed. And what we're invited into through baptism, chrismation, repentance, confession, the Eucharist, what we're invited into is a participation in that healing, what C.S. Lewis called a good infection, right? The idea that what happens when you are sick, right? You have this infection or you have some sort of wound or something like that. It's an infection that starts at one point and it begins to spread, right? That's the picture that C.S. Lewis uses to talk about this very concept in Mere Christianity. The idea that what happens in the incarnation is that there's a good infection, the dying cancerous creation that longs for healing and for life, that aches for its restoration and the rebuilding of its bridge back to God, the restoration of its hope. What happens is a good infection happens. The Creator invades the creation, taking on human nature and healing it and rebuilding that bridge. And that when you and I enter into the church, when we're baptized into Christ and we're chrismated and filled with the Holy Spirit, and we partake of his body and blood and we are restored and we begin to participate in that healing ourselves, that good infection begins to spread throughout the world. And it's made to spread throughout the entire cosmos from now until the culmination of all things. And I think the cosmos, being one giant divine organism that is made to partake of God, it intuitively understands this at some level. It longs for it and it aches for it. Plants may not be able to articulate or understand conceptually that, but there's still within the life of all of the cosmos an ache or a longing for the thing for which it is made, for its God, right? To partake of the divine nature at a degree that goes beyond what it otherwise can. And all of creation feels the breaking of that bridge. And so in the same way, in the incarnation, that hope, that restoration, that healing is what begins to percolate and break out. And I think that is the thing that all of creation feels. That when this time of year rolls around, you're not just missing some family tradition. You're not just nostalgic for certain types of action figures you used to look forward to getting at Christmas time. It's not just a looking back to a time that was more innocent. Instead, what you're really experiencing is you as a member of a cosmos that longs and aches for participation in God, that has at a deep ontological level an understanding, a longing to be something more than it is, recognizes that this is the time of year when we remember that healing that began when the Creator became a creature and began that good infection that currently spreads throughout the world. And every time this time of year rolls around, it begins to remember that. And it begins to anticipate and long for the restoration of all things, the time when finally, at long last, all of creation will partake of the divine nature in the way and to the degree it was made to from the start. That's what the incarnation is all about. And that is what I think this time of year we can all sense, the cosmic anticipation of the future celebration.
Okay, and with that, we reach the end of our second installment on My Favorite Ending. So, I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. Go ahead and hit that bell if there is a bell and leave a comment. I hear that's great for the algorithm, and also like it and tell your friends. I really appreciate your support. And until next time.